2017 also had a summit of heads of state dealing with antibiotic resistance. It's only the 4th summit that dealt with a public health risk, and they clearly stated in the conclusion of that antimicrobial resistance, as they talked about, is due to overuse, misuse in hospitals, but also in animal operations in agriculture, including in animal agriculture. And if the antibiotic resistant bacteria is present in soil and crops and water and in food, the executive officer of the Food and Agricultural Organization says that, yes, we have a problem with antibiotic resistance in hospitals, but it's also present in agriculture, and agriculture must share the responsibility. There's similar risk. I could go on, but I don't want to, belabor the point too much. But there are studies also that document similar risk associated with air pollution, water pollution, and so on. For example, 2018, the University of Iowa School of Public Health or Public Policy came out with a statement where they reviewed over 150 different studies that would indicate the environmental health risk associated with water pollution and air pollution. It focused on the state of Iowa, but it also includes studies from various other places. And their general conclusion was it's becoming impossible to avoid the preponderance of scientific evidence that links the growth in human health problems associated with air pollution, water pollution, back to industrial agriculture and confinement animal feeding operations in particular. So what does the agricultural establishment say? Well, they say these are just necessary risks. Perhaps agriculture is risky, but it's necessary because we've got to keep domestic food prices affordable. And if we do anything to restrict industrial agriculture, then food prices are going to go through the ceiling, you say. And we have to feed the world. We've got a growing global population, so we have to feed the world. How many times have you heard that? The fact of the matter is that at least for the last 20 years, industrial agriculture has not been keeping food prices in this country down. Contrary to their propaganda that they would put out, food prices in the U.S. over the past 20 years has risen faster than the overall rate of inflation, or the consumer price index. Now, farm level prices have continued to go down. Between 1970 and 1990, we did have a reduction in the percentage of income Americans were spending on food, but since then it's leveled out, and they've actually gone up since then. So what's happened is that the lower prices for what the farmer is getting out of the product has been turned into cheap raw materials, corn and soybeans primarily, that's used by the food manufacturers to turn into junk foods. Junk foods that are lacking in nutrition, that not only are providing the people, with poor nutrition and causing diet-related health problems among the people that eat it, but it's keeping the food prices higher because they're taking larger margins out of the food system and continuing to give higher retail prices at the same time they're paying the farmers less for the raw materials that come in. And in addition to that, they aren't feeding the hungry people. They aren't feeding even the hungry people in the United States with industrial agricultural product. The last report that come out on USDA come out with hunger statistics indicate that 13% of all Americans are classified as food insecure, meaning that they're not certain that they're going to be able to afford enough food to get them to the next time when they can buy food. That's about 1 in 8 Americans are classified as being hungry or food insecure. About 17% of our children live in food insecure homes. 1 in 6 of the children in the richest country in the world are hungry. It's a national disgrace. We haven't fed the hungry. When CBS did the documentary Hunger in America back in 1968 and talked about hunger and how prevalent it was, the estimate was that about 5% of Americans were hungry at that time, and it was declared a crisis. And we brought in all sorts of food assistance programs, the Great Society programs, to deal with that. And now we slough it off and ignore it as if it simply doesn't exist. And I've kind of hinted at the diet health issues that have grown prevalent as we've industrialized agriculture and turned agricultural bodies into junk food. We have an epidemic of obesity and related diseases, of diabetes and heart disease and high blood pressure and hypertension. High blood pressure and heart disease, obesity, diabetes, various other things. There are several types of cancer. You know, the healthcare costs have more than doubled as we cut the cost of food production, at least in half over some period of time. Healthcare costs are continuing to rise, and the continuing diet-related healthcare costs represent not just a physical threat to the future of our country, but also a financial threat and a higher claim on our budgets. And when we export, we were exporting about 20% of what we're growing in this country, or have been, but those exports don't go to feed the hungry people of the world. They're going to the increasingly affluent populations in places like China and in the Pacific Rim and some places in India where a growing affluent class. They aren't going to feed the hungry people of the world. And we can't claim, you know, that America's feeding the world. It's totally hypocritical when we're using 40% of our corn crop, land that could be for used food, to produce ethanol for fuel for our automobiles. The markets aren't going to feed the hungry people of the world, and industrial agriculture is not going to produce food for charity. It's an economic operation. It will not feed the world. But having said that, the rest of the world doesn't even need industrial agriculture. Most of the people don't realize it, but 70 to 80% of the people in the world are not fed by industrial agriculture. They're fed by small family farms, most of which we would call subsistence farms. And we have an abundance of research globally that indicates that you can double or triple the yields on those farms with something called agroecology that has nothing to do with industrial agriculture. You don't have to industrialize the agriculture. You can use the indigenous farming operations and improve them in such a way that those farmers can double their yield. They can feed the world without industrial agriculture. And in addition, they don't want industrial agriculture because they know now that wherever we force industrial agriculture onto other people around the world, they suffer the same kind of diet health issues that we see in the United States and other developing countries or other developed countries around the world. 2016, a panel of international experts on sustainability issued a report. They cited more than 350 different studies and saying the evidence indicting industrial agriculture for the things that I've talked about here is overwhelming. And what they called for was a fundamentally different model of agriculture. Whereas the industrial model had increased production, it hadn't solved the problems. They said we need a diverse agriculture that replaces the inputs with integrated crop and livestock systems that are holistically managed as organisms that regenerate soil health and soil productivity, that can provide incomes for more farmers, that can provide healthier foods. The research shows that these systems can compete in terms of overall production with the industrial system, that they're more resilient during a time of climate change, that they're more supportive of rural communities, that they create greater incomes for local farmers, small farmers, and they create the opportunity to improve overall human health. They're calling for something fundamentally different, an alternative kind of agriculture. And these alternatives are growing. As public concerns grow about the negative impacts of industrial agriculture that I've gone through here, that more and more people are asking for something fundamentally different. You can go and Google articles in the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, Washington Post, Des Moines Register, wherever. Just Google factory farms or CAFOs or industrial agriculture, and you'll come up with a whole host of articles, of a whole host of concerns that range from environmental and public health and animal welfare. You see this concern demonstrated in the rapid growth in consumer demand for organic products that were doubling every 3 or 4 years during the 90s and continuing to grow. People are saying, I want food that doesn't have all the chemicals and hasn't been produced with the fertilizer. I want foods that are produced without GMOs, without CAFOs. You talk about the increases in products for free-range poultry and cage-free pigs and hormone antibiotic-free pork and beef. And the systems are showing that we can produce these kind of animals and can be at least competitive at the production level with the industrial systems. The big poultry processors or contract operators, Purdue and Tyson, for example, they've already said they're moving away and having antibiotic-free. They realize that the public is waking up to the antibiotic resistance problem. And they're finding ways to give the birds more space and so on. Now, whether they can go far enough to deal with the other issues, I'm doubtful, but That's a reflection of a change in the market opportunities out there for people that want something different. And you can do it at competitive prices. Our Iowa State University came out with a study on producing hogs in deep-bedded hoop house hog systems. And by the time you trace through the modest increases of cost at the production level, if you could break that on through the system to the retail level, it would only amount to about 2 to 4 cents per pound higher for the hoop house hogs, about 1% more. The bottleneck right now is in processing the animals, getting some scale, getting some efficiency in the processing and distribution system, but that can be done. Only about 15% of what we spend on food is at the farm level. We can change the agricultural system when we change the rest of the system to accommodate it, and we can have a sustainable system for the future. You know, the evidence condemning industrial agriculture and pointing to positive alternatives that the consumers are demanding is simply becoming too great to ignore. And the agricultural establishment, again, what's their response? Well, I mentioned Tyson and Purdue and some of the others are beginning to wake up a little, but basically, the agricultural establishment's response is a giant propaganda campaign, a public relations campaign that they're spreading all around the country trying to defend the industrial system. One example is the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance. Friends of the Earth checked out the records of nonprofits. It's a nonprofit organization. They had spent $30 million between 2009 and 2013, which is what, about $6 million a year. And if you go to their website, they say clearly what they're trying to do is increase confidence and trust among the American consumer in what they call the modern food system. You don't spend $30 million to increase confidence and trust and unless you think you've got a confidence and trust problem. That's just not the way corporations operate. Friends of the Earth also found more than a dozen other front operations that's similar to the U.S. Farmers Alliance. They've been spending about $25 million a year, you know, to defend pesticides and use of antibiotics and use of GMOs and claim that their animals are well treated and things of this nature. You know, in this propaganda piece or in this propaganda message, one of the things they do frequently is they label critics, like people in communities that stand up and say, we don't want that. They say, well, the critics are uninformed, or they're uneducated. They simply need to be educated. So what we're trying to do is tell them the truth about what's going on in agriculture. They say most of these folks don't know agriculture, you know, they don't know real agriculture. They didn't grow up out here on farms. They don't understand the odors and the dust and the sound. These are just normal farming practices that, you know, that people get used to. You know, in reality, I've found something very, very different whenever I've gone out to rural areas and gone to places like this. I find that in reality, many of the people that are opposing the CAFOs are multi-generational farmers. Their families have been on these farms for decades. And they have a CAFO move in right next to them, or they have a neighbor that they've had for a long time that all of a sudden builds a CAFO instead of the traditional hog operation. They know what the sights and the smells and the sounds of farming is, and they know that this isn't farming. They know that this is something fundamentally different. It doesn't smell like a farm. It doesn't sound like a farm. It doesn't look like a farm. They know the difference. And the new people that come into the community and many times that lead the opposition, the reason they leave, that I'm convinced, is because they have fewer family ties in the community that they know will be damaged to people in the community once they stand up and resist against the people that are building new CAFOs in the area. It's not that you don't know it. I found, you know, that people that are fighting CAFOs tend to be much better informed on the issue than are people that are defending them. Because the people that are defending them is being told by their universities and by USDA and by so-called agricultural establishment that these other folks don't know anything. They're just a bunch of environmentalists or animal welfare people or PETA or vegans or whatever, and so they don't pay any attention to them, so they don't bother to understand. Where the people that oppose it have to understand both sides of the issue and are better informed. And finally, they'll get down to the point and say, well, you know, I might not even like this, but you know, this is just a consumer. We're just responding to consumer demand. We're just making a living by doing what they're telling us to do, that it's market choices. They say consumers have to vote with their dollars. They have to vote to say we don't want CAFOs or we want CAFOs, but what they're willing to buy in the store. And yes, consumers do need to vote with dollars. You know, we all need to buy things that are produced in ways that are consistent with our ethical and social values and that we can feel good about eating. We all need to do that, but we also need to recognize that the choices that are available to us today and what we have to pay for responsibly produced animal products is not just a reflection of the markets, it's a reflection of at least 60 years of government policy. And I know about that government policy because I was in the university, land-grant university system for 30 years before I retired almost 20 years ago. I was there, and in fact, I spent the early part of my career promoting industrial agriculture because I thought we were going to feed the hungry, and I thought it was going to be good for rural communities. But there was a change in public policy in this country in the late 60s and early 70s. There was a fundamental change from supporting independent family farmers to provide food security to promoting industrial agriculture as a means of making agriculture efficient and producing more at a lower cost. And that change has led to virtually every major government program, farm and food program, for the last 50 to 60 years in one way or another has subsidized, supported, allowed industrial agriculture. It's not purely a reflection of consumer choices, it's a reflection of conscious decisions made in the policy arena, and increasingly those policy decisions are being dictated by the agricultural establishment and not by the consumers that are buying the food out here. On the supply side, as I said, it's the policy choices, but on the demand side also, as I mentioned before, it's the commodities that provide the cheap raw materials, and the government has allowed the consolidation of the big food farms and has stood by the wayside as they've turned agricultural commodities into junk food that not only feed the people but keep food costs at higher levels. You know, we vote with your dollars, and we need to do that. But if you're going to vote with the dollars, you're not going to solve the hunger problems or the health issues or something, or all of those issues, because those tend to happen most prevalently to people that have fewer dollars. And when you vote with dollars, those people who need good food the most have too few dollars to vote against those that want to simply profit from the system. If we're going to have a food system that's good for people, we've got to have a government that's good for people and committed to the good of the people. If we're going to have a responsible agriculture, we've got to have a responsible government. That doesn't mean that we replace markets. Markets are tremendously important, and it's a fundamental role of markets, of the government, to make sure that markets do work. But I'm an agricultural economist, and any economist will tell you there are market failures in which government has to function. A market failure is something that needs to be done for the good of the people in general that the markets are incapable of doing. For example, I would say hunger is a market failure that has to be addressed some other way, but there's a whole range of market failures, and that's basically what I've been talking about. And I think we, the people, have a right to work through government to claim our rights to be protected and to claim and to demand that our government address the failures in our food system today. I think we have a constitutional right to protect ourselves from CAFOs. Now, the Constitution doesn't say anything specifically about clean air, clean water, and safe food, but all of those are at risk because of CAFOs and because of the industrial food system. But the 9th Amendment does say, it says that the enumeration of certain rights in this Constitution shall not be construed to disparage or deny others that are retained for the people. It specifically says in the 9th Amendment in the Bill of Rights that we didn't attempt to name all of the rights that the people have. We named specific rights, we enumerated those because those were the ones that were in greatest question. But we didn't name them all. Some of them have been later enumerated by amendments such as the banning of slavery and giving women the right to vote, and others have been interpreted to be under one of the other Bill of Rights, and others have remained unenumerated, such as the right of self-determination and self-defense. You won't find those in the Constitution, but I argue they're there, and everyone knows they're there. And if you want to find rights that were so self-evident that they didn't bother to put them in, a good place to look is in the Declaration of Independence. Because in the Declaration of Independence they wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men," it should have said people, "are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All other rights depend upon the right to life. You can't claim other rights unless you are alive. And I would contend that there is nothing more critical to the right to life than the right to clean air, clean water, and safe, healthful food. I think our Constitution guarantees us those rights, assures that we have those rights, and I think all of those fundamental rights are being threatened by industrial agriculture in general and large confinement animal feeding operations specifically. The next line of the Constitution that most times doesn't get quoted even in school after it names those three rights, it says, "To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men." It says the basic purpose of government is to ensure these rights. And the next line is deriving its just power from the consent of the government. I contend that if we have the consent of the government, a consent within a community, a consent within the state, a consent with any group that has capability of governance, we have the right to use that consent to claim our rights to clean air, clean water, and safe, healthful food. Up to now, our government has failed us. It's failed to protect the rights that have been guaranteed to us. But you know what? The Constitution also gives us the power, as well as grants us the right. Because the 10th Amendment to the Constitution says that powers not granted to the federal government or denied the state government shall be reserved for the states and for the people. We have the right to clean air, clean water, safe food. The Constitution says we have the power to get it. Now the question is, how do we exert that power? Well, the framers of the Declaration of Independence decided to revolt, but hopefully there's something short of revolt to bring it around. I say that we need to demand that our government work as it was intended. And if not, if it won't work as it intended, then we can replace it. But we can replace it peacefully, as opposed to replacing it through a violent revolution. You know, again, the Declaration of Independence says that when any government becomes destructive to these ends, which means securing our rights, then it is the right of the people to abolish that government and institute a new government that is formed in such a way and upon such principles as to the best estimate of the people to affect the safety and happiness of the people. That is the primary thing they say that a government has to do. I think we should demand of our local officials that they fulfill their responsibility to affect the safety and happiness of the people within this county, within my county, elsewhere. You know, we may not be powerful enough at this point that we can change the state and federal legislators, but we can all have an impact in our own counties, in our